Conan the Barbarian has conquered both the written word, movies, comics, and games, but behind the scenes, the buck stops with one of my fellow Norsemen, one Fredrik Malmberg. Both a movie producer, game designer, and brand developer, the Swedish-born Malmberg today serves as the CEO of Cabinet Entertainment, the owner of, among other things, Conan the Barbarian and the Robert E. Howard estate at large. Malmberg has effectively been in charge of Conan since the early 2000s, and his leadership paved the way for the modern Conan and Robert E. Howard resurgence. Today, he is joining Tom Connors,
hello,
and myself, Andre, to tell us all about that journey, acquiring and relaunching Conan in books, comics, video games, and on film, and what the future still might hold for Conan on Netflix. So with that, Fredrik Malmberg, welcome to Midnight's Edge.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here.
Today, you're in charge of both Conan, the Robert E. Howard Library, and other brands like Mutant Year Zero. But it was a long way there, so let's go back to where it all begun, in Sweden in the early 80s. How did you get started?
You have to go back another decade, actually, because I'm close to the Jurassic era now myself. So I grew up, I was born in the 60s. I was born in 1962 in Sweden, which was in rural Sweden, which was a very different era before internet and social media and mobile phones, and it was just a very different world. And I early on was very attracted to games, board games. I would play all these children's games and quickly tired of the banality of these games, because after maybe I was 10 years old, so maybe early 70s, me and my friends, we had been modding Risk for so many. I mean, we had everything from oil wells to, we basically made Risk into a modern day war game. And then all of a sudden I realized, reading in a military magazine, I read a review about war games, the new phenomena on the other side of the Atlantic. So at the age of 12, I ordered by mail ordered a copy of a war game called Napoleon at Waterloo. I was a big Napoleon fan, of course. I loved history, and that led to my new hobby then, which was wargaming. And as some of your listeners may know, wargaming, you had either the tabletop map version with little counters and hex grids that you shuffled these counters around, and you also had the miniatures wargaming side, which was the precursor to Dungeons and Dragons. So the Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson had this miniature system called Greyhawk, which was basically a great, a battle game. And then one day, I think it was Gary Gygax who just plopped down a miniature and said, "This is a wizard," obviously inspired from the Howard Conan stories and Lord of the Rings. And that really got me into gaming in a big way. So in the 70s, I was a teenager and I started importing these board games to Sweden from the US and made a lot of connections and friends in that industry. And that led to me going over for a year as an intern working for these American game publishers in 1980, I think that was.
Yeah, so now we have come into the 1980s, which is where you first enter the professional career map. Where did you start out, and what did you do when in the States?
So in the States, I worked for a few game distributors, and I ended up on the West Coast and spent a lot of time at a small publisher called Chaosium. Chaosium was a role-playing game publisher, and they're most famous for RuneQuest, which was one of the first percentile systems, as opposed to Dungeons and Dragons level-based system. In RuneQuest, you play and you have skill. It's a skill-based system where you have a little more modern version, more realistic version. So I really hung out with those guys and play tested their new upcoming games, such as Call of Cthulhu and Stormbringer. And the end result was that when I was going back to Sweden, because I was, I had to do my army service and I was going to go to university, all these things. Then I asked Greg Stafford, who was the owner of Chaosium, if I could take out a license to their basic role-playing or Magic World system, an engine, call it. And I brought that license with me to Sweden, and we published in 1982 the Swedish game Drakar and Demoner, which it was slow in the beginning, but after 2 years we had sold out of the 5,000 print run, and we did a second edition which just went through the roof in 1984 to 86. So in the mid-80s, if you were a middle grader, of course boys mostly at the time, then you would play Drakar and Demoner and Mutant, which was the second follow-up game that we did. And this became the reason why I got involved in games. So in the 80s, I was publishing under license most of the American big tabletop role-playing games, but also started a book line under the name of Drakar and Demoner series, and that was the first paperback line of science fiction and fantasy paperbacks in Sweden. And this was a pretty big business. So me and my companions, we were 4 partners at the time, we controlled the retail trade and the importation and also the publishing of genre games, I would say, in the 80s in Swedish. And we also did a Norwegian and a Danish version as well.
Let's get back to the paperback imprint of Drakar och Demoner, which incidentally means dragons and demons to anyone wondering. That is where the Lancer and Ace editions of the Conan books were first translated to and printed in Swedish, isn't it?
That's exactly right. The first 2 books, I think, we published in that series, and that was a series of over 60 paperbacks. But the first 2 books were the Ace editions of Conan. So the first 2 were Conan's, and then, of course, we did several others later on in the series. But we brought Terry Pratchett to Swedish. We did all the classic Fritz Lieber. We did all of those classic books. Moorcock, of course, Corum, Elric. They were first published in Swedish in our publishing house.
That's awesome. Also, I have to ask, who was the one who did the translation from English to Swedish?
We had different translators, and for Conan, it was interesting. It was a retired teacher, I think, or history professor, and he had no relation at all to Conan. He didn't know it before, but he came in and he said this was actually, he was expecting some bad pulp fiction, basically. But he came in, and I remember when he delivered the manuscript, and he said, I was fascinated. This reads a lot like Röde Orm, which is, of course, the long ships in English, and he was actually, it's a very difficult task to translate Howard, because he almost has his own language. So I haven't gone back and read the translation, and maybe I should. I'm not 100% sure it was a great translation, but at least the translator enjoyed the task.
I also have to ask, how familiar were you with Conan to begin with? What made you choose to license and translate the Conan books into Swedish?
That's a really good question. When I grew up, I read the first fantasy. Of course, in the Nordic culture, we have Astrid Lindgren. She wrote about the brothers Lionheart, which has fantasy elements in it. And if you were a child in the Nordic region, you would be automatically reading everything Astrid Lindgren from 5 to 7 years old.
Yeah, I can confirm this to be accurate to anyone wondering. Even in Norway, we grew up with Astrid Lindgren, both in books and on TV.
And of course, the medieval fantasy of the brothers Lionheart, and then the really rise of fantasy through Lord of the Rings, which was the only fantasy book that would be translated into the Swedish language. The rest was just not considered real literature. And the publishing industry is a very conservative industry, and at the time, nobody would touch fantasy. Science fiction is a different thing. Science fiction books were actually considered real literature. So we had a wide range of science fiction literature to buy in Swedish language. And you have to remember, if you're 10 years old, it's very hard to read something in English language if it's not your even second or third language. So having struggled through the Swedish first volume of Lord of the Rings, and then I was kind of bit by the genre. I think then I quickly found myself having to basically buy English version of fantasy books, and Howard's. I think actually before I discovered Howard, and right on the tail of finishing up the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and we're talking early 70s here, I found Michael Moorcock, because Michael Moorcock was a British author, and he was widely available through European distributors. So it was easier to find those books than Conan books, which were later. They started publishing them in England in the end of the 70s, after the Ace editions became a hit in the US. So I did not discover Conan until late 70s and before I came to the States. But then, of course, the movie, I knew of Conan before. I had read the stories before. I wasn't as bit by them as I was of Lord of the Rings, or even the Moorcock versions, which I think I looked for the longer narrative as opposed to the short stories, which I now find is actually very refreshing. I prefer the short stories to long, epic 3-volume books. But at the time, when you're a teenager and you're in your book devouring years, I started with those, and I did not really discover Conan until really after the movie, when he became, of course, I mean, that was just the first time you saw a real medieval fantasy. It was just, and Arnold was a walking special effect. The whole film was just so great, and so it was just, I think it was really, looking back, I think it was more of a commercial decision that, well, of course we have to bring out Conan because nobody had really done that, and it was on the heels of the film. I think we started the book publishing division in 1985. And the movie was in 1982. So it took a while to get going, and it was pretty much, I think, a solid choice that, okay, we have to start with Conan. So that's how I remember it.
So what was your first memory of seeing the film itself, though? The first original film?
Well, remember, this was in Sweden in the 80s, and we still had censorship, and you knew this. So going into the theaters, we couldn't see the pit fight, for instance. That was cut. But remember, a movie like RoboCop, that they cut 20 minutes on RoboCop. So, and yeah, 20 minutes. So, he walks into, I remember the RoboCop was just bizarre. He's there, and he's like all decked out, and he's going to get the hoodlums, and he's turning the corner, and boom, then we just see the aftermath. And it's like, what's going on here? and you can imagine watching Conan the Barbarian without the pit fight, all these great things. But knowing from Cinefantastique and all that, I was of course importing things from the US, and I could see that there are things to this which I have not been able to see. It was extremely frustrating. We had the same with Road Warrior, which was the Mad Max movie, and then even videos were, VHS tapes had to be rated and cut and approved by the censorship board. So I remember the Conan film more for the amazing score. I thought that Polidori's score is just, it's my favorite score, I think, ever. And of course, the vistas, and when Conan is running across all of the Hyborian lands and down into, I guess, Stygia, or wherever he's running to. And growing up as a kid in the country, I felt, I think the film spoke to me because, to many Nordic people, or I think to anybody who grows up in a rural area, it's kind of Cimmeria, and if you have ambitions and you want to do things, Conan is a great driver and a great proponent to sort of look up to. And so I think I was just taken away by the whole story, and of course the snake fight was cool, and I had never seen a movie which was a fantasy movie. And after that, the next film after that was Willow, which I just like, this is pathetic. It's like, what is this? This is just strange, because of the true nature of Conan. It was realistic, and they didn't try to talk down to the audience. They were really taking us, the genre-loving people, which we didn't even know we were. I mean, of course, I had seen Star Wars. That was great. But this was something different. This was real. It was our history. It felt like, it had the salt of the earth, or the taste of the earth, to me. And I think a lot of people also had the same revelation when they saw that movie for the first time.
Your path would cross with that of Conan again later on, but before that, there was Mutant Chronicles. Can you tell us about that?
So when I started importing games to Sweden in the 80s, well, actually that was in the 70s, I would go to little gatherings, little conventions, like, precursors to today's Comic-Con, but for gamers. And we would be, a couple of hundred people in Stockholm or Gothenburg, and I would bring my suitcase with games to sell as a teenager. And then my company that I founded was Wellington War Games, and I published, when I was 14, I self-published a little war game called Fight for Tobruk, which was an abysmal failure. It was the last game I designed myself. It was absolutely catastrophic and awful, and I printed 1,000 copies. I think I sold 40, but it was a great learning lesson that, I'm a good publisher, but I'm not a great designer. So that led to, I needed to make something bigger, and I needed to move out of my little rural town. I needed to move to a bigger market. So I wanted to move to Stockholm. I met with some friends from my gaming circles, and we all agreed, let's start a company, and we will all import the games, and we will all chip in $400 each. And then we can, if we don't sell the games, we can get them ourselves. So I knew from my mail order business that I had been running, I knew the distributors and in the States. So we started Target Games as in a basement in the suburb of Stockholm. And we opened that on September 4th, 1980, and started selling games there. And that company, Target Games, became the locomotive for building up a retail chain called Tradition for games, and also for Äventyrsspel, which was our publishing label, where Drakar and Warner, which was based on the Chaosium engine, the basic role-playing engine. That was the first Swedish fantasy tabletop RPG, published in 1982, resounding success. And in 2 years after that, we followed up with a post-apocalyptic anthropomorphic game set in a bombed-out, plague-ridden Scandinavia, a couple of hundred years in the future. And that was Mutant, which also became a resounding success, but only in the Swedish language. And 10 years later, well, actually, in every 3-year cycle, we had to republish the game to follow the age demographic of our audience. And we started selling our games to middle graders, and then, after 3 years, they were 16, and then they wanted to have a little more adult themes in their games, and that was Mutant became the vehicle for that. So Mutant went through a cyberpunk phase, and then it went into a Warhammer 40K-like stage, and then eventually in the early 90s, we published a space opera setting called Mutant Chronicles, and that became almost the peak for Target Games in its ambitions to do an international quality game line. And that's also what got me over to Hollywood to talk about feature film options for the IP.
So Mutant Chronicles brought you back to America, and to Hollywood at that. How was the transition from doing business in Sweden to doing business in LA?
As I said, when we published Mutant Chronicles, which was both comic books and collector cards and computer games and whatnot, I started traveling to, of course, all the book shows to see if we could find publishing partners on the book side, the toy shows, Toy Fair in New York. So I had been doing business with the United States since the 70s. So I was very familiar, but Los Angeles, I had not really been to Los Angeles until Mutant Chronicles hit, and we started negotiating with some studios for a film option. And I ended up doing a deal with Ed Pressman, who was a film producer from Conan fame, of course. That was his big film. But not only that, he also had produced Wall Street. He produced a ton of films. Badlands was an Ed Pressman film.
At this time, he would also be producing Judge Dredd with Stallone.
That's correct. And that was about the time when I was there, because he wanted to do basically more genre movies. And he had just, he was working on The Crow when I met him. And I was introduced to him from Paramount, actually, because one of the Paramount executives on the merchandising side came to Stockholm, came to my company, and they saw all the toys and stuff we had done for Mutant Chronicles. And I think what they wanted me to do was import Star Trek toys to Sweden, which I did not want to do at all. But I wanted to sell them Mutant Chronicles. And of course, then the Paramount executive said, I know a guy who would be the right person for this. His name is Ed Pressman. So they introduced me. This was through, before internet. So it would be fax. We would send faxes around the world. And at the same time, his brother, James Pressman, who was head of the toy company, Pressman Toy Company, they were our partners on the big Siege of the Citadel Mutant Chronicles board game for the US market. And James, or Jim, he introduced me at the same time. So Ed got, 2 faxes saying, you should talk to this guy from Sweden. And then I wanted to come out and talk about the movie option with some people here who had expressed an interest, and I ended up going here. So this must have been 1995. And I did not like Los Angeles very much at the time because, if the big urban cities of Europe, nobody drives a car. We all go with, public transportation, and Los Angeles was just a big, scary, weird, strange city. I cannot say I liked it, but I had to come back probably. Because here's the thing: is nothing happens if you're coming from outside of Hollywood. Nothing will happen for the first couple of days when you come to town, and then people start calling you in your hotel and say, oh, can we take a meeting? Can we take a meeting? Can you come today? Can you come today? And then let's say you planned a week or 2 in Los Angeles. You really don't get the good meetings until the last 2-3 days. And then you're on the plane out of town, going back to wherever you're from. And you think, okay, we got a movie going, or we have our director, or we have this. But the minute you leave this town, everything stops with your project and you're going back into the black hole, basically. So that was my experience of LA, was that everybody's just so positive and they're like, this is the greatest thing we've ever seen and we're going to do this. Wow. And I ended up having probably 4 or 5 different movie options for IP that I controlled. And nothing was really happening. They kept paying these yearly option fees. So we got cash, but at the end of the day, you really want to see your project made too. So I decided I didn't decide to move here until a couple of years in from when we had acquired the Conan IP, actually. But I knew that if we ever really want to make this successful, someone, I myself, has to move to the States, has to move to LA.
So getting a Conan movie made is what ultimately caused you to relocate to the US. But before that, you had to acquire the ownership of the Conan rights. How did that come about?
So in the mid-90s, the games company that I had started, Target Games, we realized we have to get into video games. Because video games we could see it from the retail stores we owned, that video games had become more than 50% of the games market, and it was growing like crazy. Paper role-playing games were going the other way because people were growing up and they were going into college and they were getting married. But video games, that was what the young people were playing. So I started what was called Target Interactive, and we launched 6 games. We started working on Europa Universalis, Airfix Dogfighter, Drakar and Demoner, Valhalla Chronicles, a line of PC games. Sverige was a very big, that was the Kingdom of Sweden, historic titles. We did that quite successfully and changed the name to Paradox Entertainment, because the parent company went public and went into a similar process as a Chapter 11 restructuring, a financial restructuring. And the company that I was head of at the time was the subsidiary Target Interactive. And we changed the name of that entity to Paradox Entertainment, and we made a bid for the parent. So it was a way to get the parent corporation out of its default. So we signed an IOU to the parent company, and 2 years later we paid off that IOU to make the parent company whole. The only thing that parent company was left with was then the stock listing. So the shareholders then would repackage and they would make that into telecom industry company of some sorts. And Paradox Entertainment then went on as a video game publisher. And in early 2000s, this was in 98, 99. And in the early 2000s, 2001, my board of directors, which we inherited from the old Target game structure with 2,000 shareholders, so everybody who had a share in the old company got a share in Paradox as well. So my board was saying, okay, we're facing a change, a platform change. Xbox was on the horizon, and the consoles were taking over, and the PC at the time, the PC market was having a hard time because basically that was sold through retail outlets. This is before Steam. This is before Epic. So we were forced to find distributors worldwide in each national language who would distribute our PC games to retail shops. And this was just basically, the effect was basically for a $60 or €60 game, the developer would get $3 maybe, $3 to $5 a euro. So it was extremely difficult to see how that market would evolve. And also the console market was on the opposite side of the spectrum, because the console market was great for the big six, EA and Activision, and because the console could carry so much graphic files that you could make these amazingly beautiful games. But they would have budgets of up to $30-40 million. So the little players were squeezed, and my board said, can we get into the IP development? We know that you were good at that. Can't we focus on the IP stuff? Can you find something? And I remember I said to the board as well, yeah, but our IP they're Nordic centric and they're a little, worn out. We've been beating this Mutant Chronicles to death. What am I going to do? So they said, well, maybe we can scrape some money together if you find something that you think is AAA. And my definition of AAA at the time was, it has to be successful in more than one media. So, for instance, not just a big movie or just a big video game or a big comic. I wanted something that really had proven itself in more than one media, and it needed to be internationally recognized. So I didn't want to find something which was super big in Germany but nowhere else, for instance. So those were two criteria. And then, of course, the challenge was to find something. So I talked to my people at the company and said, okay, let's make a list of what happened to that character, what happened to this character. And unbeknownst to me at the time, we made a list of about 40, 50 characters and IPs. And Conan was at the top. What happened to Conan? This is 2001. And the last we had seen really of Conan, and we didn't even see it in Europe, was the Ralph Miller TV series. That had never really been sold outside of Germany, I think. So I had no idea that it existed. The last film was Conan the Destroyer, which to me was a failure creatively and business wise as well. So, and then of course in the early 90s, Hasbro had launched a big toy line, which was beautiful, but of course it was for children, right? So that was on top of our list. What happened to Conan? Tons of other Howard characters. Solomon Kane, because we remembered the comics, and that's a good character. What happened to Solomon Kane? And Kull. Where's Kull? So on the top 40, I can't say that I myself knew how much Howard had actually created. To me, I knew Robert E. Howard created Conan, but I hadn't made the connection that, he also had created Solomon Kane, and he also created all these other amazing characters, because I can't say that I had been that much of a fan myself of specifically Robert E. Howard material. But it was clear when I then went on precursor to Google, Alta Vista, and I'm going to work myself down the list and see where are these IPs right now. And the first thing that comes up is that a couple of months before, Conan Properties had been transferred over to StanleyMedia.com, which had just been put into receivership because the CEO had taken the IPO money, $20 million, and fled to Brazil. So he had been jailed, and they had gone out and brought him back to the US. The company was in receivership, and to me as a businessman, that signaled an opportunity. And then we just dug deep to find out who represented the estate and how was that. And that was a very complex negotiation to get it out of the previous ownership structure.
Yeah, that was no doubt a complex situation, and Stanley Media would be a thorn in the side later on. But in the end, you were successful in acquiring not just Conan, but the entire Robert E. Howard estate. Can you elaborate on how that happened, and what you planned on doing with the rights once you had them?
Well, we started with only Conan, and we found out in 2001, after 3 months of just basically traveling around and making phone calls, we found that there were three factions, three owners. There was the heirs of Howard had 40%, and the heirs of Sprague de Camp had 40%, and then their lawyer Arthur Lieberman controlled the 20% in between. And Arthur Lieberman came to the picture in the 70s when Sprague de Camp, or actually when Ed Pressman wanted to make the movie in 1977, he couldn't see that there was a clear chain of title. And he couldn't get a clear chain of title. So he told the estate at the time, you have to get me a counter opponent that I can close a deal with. And that's when Conan Properties was founded. And the advisor to Sprague de Camp was Arthur Lieberman. So Sprague de Camp and all the people who had written pastiche works assigned their copyrights into Conan Properties for a compensation. And then as a thank you to Arthur for doing all of this, Sprague was very clever, or some would say devious, because he made sure that the estate would then agree, why don't we take 40 each and then we give Arthur 20%, which effectively meant that Arthur ran the whole show for 25 years, because basically he had the controlling vote and he was in charge of all the merchandising and licensing and the media deals. And Sprague was an author of his own, but he was also the editor of the Howard stories and had inserted himself and changed a lot of the Howard materials. And this became quite evident when we were doing our research, that there were three big factions, three big fan groups to Conan. There was the movie fans, I should say, and the Arnold fans. But that group was also quite different within itself, because you had the bodybuilders, you had a lot of bikers who liked that movie, and you had the Howard fans who wanted the movie to be what Howard wrote, and it really wasn't. And then we had the Marvel comic fans, and then so it was a very fragmented customer base. And what we could see was actually that we need to bring back the unabridged Howard stories, because it's all over the place. I mean, the Ralph Muller Conan looks one way, and then Bushima's Conan looks another way, and then you have all these. It was just a very, very mismanaged IP. It was so clear to me that we need to really kill everything. We did the deal. It was a step deal where we paid partially. We put down one sum first, and then we agreed to pay more There was a movie option in that package with Warner Brothers. If that would happen, we would pay them a bonus. So in my first year, 2002, I started going to all these companies that had previous relationships with Conan Properties. And at the time, the only deal that was active was a Warner Brothers option. There were no other deals on the table. So the first thing that I did in 2002 was to find out who else can buy into, and I also wanted to really pressure test my own theory that what we need to do is go back to Howard's Conan, because that was clear to me. We have to do this. In that sense, I think I made enemies because a lot of people saw that as an anti-Arnold stance, which it wasn't at all. I loved the movie. I love Arnold's Conan, but it's not Howard's Conan. And we definitely made that as a decision, and people misinterpreted that as okay, that means that Fred is, he's not a fan of Arnold, or he's not a fan of the Marvel comics. Not at all. We just wanted to have a clean, new relaunch of what is Conan. So I traveled around the country and I talked to a lot of high profile people. I met with Todd McFarlane, who was a big Conan fan, and he also agreed we should do the real Conan toy line. I met with all the comic book publishers, but Mike Richardson at Dark Horse, he was just basically saying everything that I wanted to hear, that let's do it, let's get the best team, let's be really true to Howard. At the time, Marvel had lost the Conan license, and they had just basically resurfaced from their chapter 11. So they were not really a viable partner, and the last 10 years at Marvel had been awful. So we did the deal with Dark Horse to get the comic book up and running, because we knew we have a huge comic book fan base. So let's keep that going quickly and get a monthly Conan comic up and running. I need a good toy line to send to people, as here are some physical representations of what Conan and other characters look like. And the icing on the cake, or what was coming from my own perspective of going through games and role-playing games and universe building and world building, what I wanted to do with Conan was to really show that there is a whole world. It's not just one character, but it's a whole world of races and countries and insignia and weaponry, and and this is, we have to remember, this is before Lord of the Rings. But to me, it was clear, in order to do that, we have to do RPGs. We have to do role-playing world books that describe all of this information to really make this a believable world, which I thought that the Highborn Age is a believable age. It's supposed to be about 12,000 years ago, before the Ice Age. So it felt to me like what we then have to do is find a tabletop role-playing game partner, which we did, and we have to find a video game partner. And that is how I ended up with Funcom in Norway, who we visited them. They had come out of a pretty tough launch on an MMORPG, which is basically, for the listeners who don't know, that's kind of like World of Warcraft. And this is prior to World of Warcraft. You had EverQuest, and you had a couple of other games where you play a character in a fantasy world, and you can play with your friends. And we had, in Paradox, we had tried to launch a similar title based on Mutant Chronicles called Warzone Online. And we failed miserably. It was extremely difficult to make these kinds of games and very costly. But I met with these Norwegian creators, and I really believed that they could do this, because they really got Conan. And I must say that I think Conan has a special place in Norway, because at the time we had two partners that had kept publishing the Marvel comics in black and white, and some color too. And that was Panini in Italy and Bladkompaniet, a publisher in Norway. So they had never stopped publishing the comic books. And they were the oldest licensees in our archives. We could see that, well, they never stopped. They just kept going from the 70s. And I think that was a big reason why Conan has a special place also in the Norwegian sensibilities and the Norwegian culture, because I think the Norwegian, and I may be generalizing, and Andre, you may be chopping my head off for saying this, but I think that Norwegians have a close a close relationship with nature, and I think that they, really see the melancholy of what Conan is going through, and the big mountains and the sea, and the drive to not be in big cities and not be in a civilized environment, but really be true to yourself. I think they actually have a higher they read into Conan what I myself did when I was leaving, my little rural background, just like Conan. And when you leave that, but you look back and think, maybe it was a simpler life, but it was a different life. So I started that relationship with Funcom in 2003, and they embarked on what was to become a defining part of the whole Conan IP franchise, because they put some really fantastic creative talent onto everything from concept designs and costumes and weaponry, and I found them to be extremely good for the IP development.
Yeah, I will say that you are completely right, by the way. For those that are listening, Fredrik is Swedish, I'm Norwegian. We have this friendly rivalry going on, and we're so alike, but still so different in some ways, but you nailed it completely. Conan has very strong appeal to Norwegians, since we see exactly what you mentioned. And yeah, I think it may be stereotypical. Many Norwegians may be closer tied to nature, because you have Oslo, but just 10 minutes outside of Oslo, you have the wilderness, and people are really happy about that. And also, yeah, Bladkompaniet, they kept on publishing Conan when no one else did, ensuring ever new generations of fans rediscovering the stories. So the Norwegians in Funcom, yeah, they probably were among the biggest Conan fans on the planet. They absolutely would get the world, and that also came across in the finished products.
Yes, and I remember when we started talking to them, and I had 3 or 4 big companies interested in doing a Conan MMORPG. One of them, the real only contender to Funcom, was Sony Online. Sony Online was a massive giant at the time, but they didn't nail the creative. And I still remember when there were 3 Norwegians coming, Gaute Godager, who was going to be the game designer, and the CEO, and they had a little team came over to Stockholm, and they just showed some basically concepts, and just hearing them talk about what they wanted this world to be just felt okay. And that has always been my MO, is you have to find the passion. If you find the passion, it's going to be good. They may not succeed on other levels, business wise or whatever, but at least you can be proud of what's there. And yeah, so we still work with Funcom, and this is now, I guess we're on the 17th year.
So, you were able to relaunch Howard's Conan in the comics. You arranged to have the Age of Conan featured in games, but then there is the publishing side. Millions of Conan paperbacks had been sold since the 60s onwards, but the stories had been edited and rewritten by L. Sprague de Camp. Many of Robert E. Howard's original unedited stories had not seen print since their original publication in Weird Tales magazine back in the 1930s. Now that changed when you took over. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, so as long as Sprague de Camp was alive and he owned or controlled 40% of the estate, he would not allow for the unedited, the unabridged stories to really be widely circulated. And again, prior to the internet and the web, it was very difficult for a lot of people to sort of see the difference. What is the difference? You go out, you buy a paperback, and that's the Conan story. Well, what they didn't know was that Sprague, he changed them, and he wrote extra stories himself, and he changed the narrative. And of course, there was a growing circle of scholars, and they had something called the REHUPA, which was a Robert E. Howard University Press Association, where they would exchange ideas. And in the 80s, a small group started the Robert E. Howard Days, where on the anniversary of his death, they would go to Cross Plains and celebrate his work. And they would start finding the original typescripts from Howard's then literary agent, Glenn Lord. So the scholars started to see that they were becoming very upset because they rightly so thought that, he was the father of American fantasy, or at least of the sword and sandals genre, and it's not available for the audience. Instead, they're getting this bastardized version, whether it's good or bad, because Sprague de Camp wasn't as bad of an author as people may think, but it was hidden away from the world. And then there was this small English publisher, Wandering Star, who had just gotten the rights from Conan Properties before we took over to actually, they had listened to these scholars and they thought that, there's probably market to do a limited edition, 1,000 each, of the unabridged Howard short stories of Conan. They had started first with doing some non-Conan stories, and they had done a Solomon Kane, but then the new heirs of the estate said that let's give them this license. So the UK publisher Wandering Star were in the works of this project, which was very ambitious. And when we took over CPI, I met with them, and I felt that this was actually very important for us to get to a wider audience. And that's how we ended up doing a deal, which was essentially we brokered a deal with Random House, with Del Rey, so that they would take out the sub-license from these Wandering Star editions. And the Wandering Star editions, which were very limited edition, very expensive, $300-400, upwards $2,000 for certain very rare editions, that became a trade paperback version from Del Rey, which was available then at any bookstore in the US for, $14 or something like that. So those 3 volumes were published quickly after we took over the ownership of CPI and the control of CPI, I should say, in 2002. So we brokered that deal right away. That was one of the first deals we did with Del Rey.
Yeah, I have to say, the Del Rey editions are the definitive versions out there. So for anyone wanting to read Howard's original stories, those are the ones to get. So, you had relaunched the original Conan stories in print, relaunched the comics based on those original stories, and facilitated Conan's world being explored in Age of Conan. But then there was making another feature film, and getting there was a long journey. Can you take us through it?
Yeah, so when I had been dabbling with Hollywood, going back and forth with my options that never came to fruition, as I told you before earlier. But I knew with Conan, it's such a big American IP that you have to operate the whole CPI business out of the US. So I started traveling before I moved to LA. I started traveling a lot, and of course, getting a film off the ground would be massive for the IP, because at the time when we took over, there was really no activity. And the way that merchandising and licensing works, it is very entertainment driven, because it's also about getting the confidence from investors who make these big merchandising toy lines and video games. It needs confidence that a lot of people like this character. Is it relevant? People kept asking me, why are you doing this with something which was a bodybuilder for 25 years ago? I said, no, you haven't seen this yet. So when we acquired CPI in 2002, there was an option with Warner Brothers that was about to expire. And what Warner Brothers wanted to do was to support the Wachowski brothers at the time. They had just done Matrix, extremely successful film for them and for Warner Brothers. They were huge Conan fans, and they had convinced Warner Brothers that take out an option to Conan because we want to co-direct together with John Milius. So when your biggest director tells you, and this is very common in Hollywood, is the big studios, they have a big, I would almost call it like it's a chamber of treasures, and that's what do they control, so that when a big director comes into the head of the studio, in this case it was in the early 2000s, they can open the door to their treasure chamber and say, well, we have Captain Blood and we have Conan. and we have Elric, and we have Star Wars, and then the big directors will fall for that and says, "Oh, okay, I'll do a deal." And the mutual understanding is that, well, you do a couple of big commercial hits for us that we know that you can do, and then you get to do your favorite project. Same with actors. You have to do a little bit of Twilight, and then you can do your indie budget movie, and we'll finance that too. So it's sort of it's a quid pro quo. So we were stuck with that. I went to Warner Brothers, and it was clear that they didn't know, because that's how Hollywood works. It's never like, somebody's going to make a movie and then they start doing it and then it's happening. It's always a chain of events that need to be perfect. And at the time, the Wachowskis were busy doing Matrix 2. So Conan was just sitting in their treasure chamber waiting for them to be ready. But of course, so the option expired, and we went out to all the other studios. And then it turned out actually that Sony was very interested. Actually, not Sony, but Sam Raimi. It was Sam Raimi was very interested, and he called me. I was in Sweden, and that's another Hollywood thing. Is like, whenever they want to speak to somebody, they just tell their assistant, "I need to speak to that guy." And nobody in Hollywood knows anything about time zones or anything or where people are. So I got a call at 2 a.m. in Stockholm, and it's "Hold on from Mr. Raimi." And then it's Sam Raimi calling from set on Spider-Man 2. And I think it was like December or something. And telling of his love of Conan, and he wants to do Conan. And long story short, that leaked somehow that Sony was really going to pick up the Conan rights. So all of a sudden, I don't know this, but I have a feeling that the Wachowskis caught wind of this and started calling the Warner Brothers people and said, "What are you doing? We're going to lose. We want to do Conan. You can't let it go." So we actually closed a new deal with Warner's, which was even stronger than the deal before, which was a very, very big, very powerful deal that my predecessors had negotiated. But we ended up getting an even better deal. And this was then, I guess, late 2002, early 2003. And then that project, which I thought was going to be, great. And I started to plan my move to the US because things were picking up business-wise. And we went through, it was clear after Matrix 2, nothing happened. I met with John Milius. He had a little house on the lot of Warner Brothers. And I think he was writing the story, and he was working with them, and nothing really happened. And then during Matrix 3, I think it was clear that the Wachowskis were not going to, they had enough. They were burned out. They had personal problems. They were going through, the whole thing with the transgender issue coming up for them. And also, I think the process of the whole Matrix project was just too much. So the message we got was that they wanted to focus on video games. They were going to make a video game. They were going to sort of step back a little bit. But at the same time, Robert Rodriguez reached out. So through his people, this spreads. The community gets hold of news like this, even though, we can't really go out at the time. I can't go out and tell, Variety or Hollywood Reporter that, this is industry work, and you have to respect that, we can't be driven by the rumor mill, but everybody who is in Hollywood will pick up these news, like what's happening there. So Robert Rodriguez turned out to be a massive Conan fan. He's also a big Frank Frazetta fan. So he calls and says, "I'm really interested." And of course, for me personally, that's great. Big fan of Robert Rodriguez. He could be fantastic. We could do a great film. And so the Warner's project kept going, but now it was going to be with Rodriguez. So again, he was a very in-demand director at the time, and this was around Sin City had just premiered, or it was premiering around that time, and I had just moved to the US, and we felt, okay, well, if we at least get it. I went down to see him at Troublemaker Studios in Texas, but it was clear that Harvey Weinstein wouldn't let go of Robert Rodriguez that easy. So, of course, he kept throwing stuff at at Robert all the time, so he couldn't really focus on Conan. And that's when we ended up in these endless extensions, 1-year extensions of the option with Warner Brothers. And it became a very big thorn for us at CPI, at Conan Properties, because remember, we had an entity now that was against my will, but the board really wanted to go public. So the company was preparing to go public. So I had 2,000 shareholders and a big board who demanded to see some action. When's the movie coming out? When's the movie coming out? Furthermore, we also had an issue of the last installment payment, which was a big payment for the purchase of CPI, and not actually CPI, but for the rest of the library, which was subsequently bought by CPI from the estate. So that was another multi-million-dollar deal that had to be paid off. And everybody was looking at me like, do more deals, get more stuff in. And of course, the movie was a crucial factor for us. And it was clear at one point when it was also clear that Robert Rodriguez he didn't want to let go of this film, but it was a big project. And I think he wanted to bring in a co-director for various reasons. We got a call after one of these extensions. Harvey kept him doing other movies for the Weinstein Company. And at that time, you could say that, he was really Dimension. That was Robert Rodriguez, was the Dimension label.
Pretty much between him and Tarantino.
Well, Tarantino was more Miramax. He was big,
that's true.
So Robert Rodriguez was kind of like the little brother of Tarantino, so sort of. But he was very well taken care of by them. He was the star for them, and they fought very hard to keep him busy. And then I think that pressure got to him too. So we got a call when there was another extension was coming up, and I had told everybody. I said, nope, we're not going to extend one more year. I need to get a movie going. And then we had a call from Robert where he basically said, I had dinner with Jim Cameron the other night, and he wants to co-direct with me. And I'm going, oh my God, what is this? This is going to, just tracking down James Cameron to confirm that would be a massive task. But we did. We managed to track him down, and he confirmed that, yeah, we had dinner. That would be fun. But we also knew, okay, when is this movie going to get made? James Cameron, that could take 10 years before we see this movie. But we agreed and told Warner Brothers, this is their last extension. We will do another 12-month extension. And that takes us into 2007 in the summer. And that's when we have our final installment payment to the estate, big payment coming up end of August. And I'm sitting there knowing that, this is not happening with Warner's. I'm talking to CAA, and we agree, let's go out when the Warner's term expires for their option. Let's go out to all the studios and see how can we get going. And here's the term sheet. These are the terms we want. And that's not to say that, it becomes the deal, because of course then it's up to people to sort of, it's like fishing, you send out the bait and then you see who's nibbling on it. And if there is a competitive scenario, you might get your term sheet or even improve on it. And all the studios wanted it, and they wanted it for various producers that had deals with them. But I was not happy with how CAA handled that situation. It was not to my liking. And I had my own connection. I wanted to make this movie with Mark Ordesky as an executive over at New Line Cinema, and New Line had just been extremely successful with Lord of the Rings. And I met with Mark a couple of times. He came through to me with flying colors. He was very genuine. I trusted him, and I thought he could get this going. If he could, he is the man who really got Lord of the Rings financed and set up, because he really believed in Peter Jackson's vision, and he knew Peter from his college days. We had a very similar background. He's also a gamer. He's still a big Dungeons and Dragons player, and he's also a word builder, and he totally bought into what I was saying, and I totally bought into him too. So we kind of worked on, let's do this, and we finally got a deal memo coming in during the summer. I think this was late June of 2007. And remember, I had this big payment to do end of August. And one of the studios that had come in and said, we will pay the term sheet, we will do the term sheet, and here's a huge pay-or-play offer for Vin Diesel to play Conan, was New Image and Avi Lerner. And I didn't really consider it much at the time, although one of my other friends, since I had moved to LA, Joe Gatta, was an executive there, and I knew Joe, and he had been an agent, and we had worked together for some years before. So you had to take it at least seriously. But my personal favorite, where we should end with, even if we hadn't, that was maybe not the best financial deal, but the best creative deal would have been with New Line. And then in that summer, something happened over at New Line. So that can be, we call it deal fatigue, when you negotiate, and then everybody just gets tired and the steam leaves the engine, sort of. But that wasn't the case here. It was more, why don't we sign the deal that we've now agreed? And there were fewer and fewer, calls coming in from them. And then you get really nervous, because it's hard to describe, but you can get that feeling of, okay, this is slipping away. And end of July, nothing was happening, and we had sort of sitting there for 5 weeks, and you start wondering what's going on here. And I remember, because of course my relationship with Mark Ordesky, we had built a really good personal relationship. I was down at Comic-Con, and I was being chased by Joe from New Image saying, they're not going to do the deal. They're not going to do the deal. So why don't we do the deal with us instead? And I was really thinking, there's something to this. And I called Mark and I said, Mark, this deal isn't happening, is it? And he said, give me a couple of hours, I'll check out. And then he called me back after a few hours, says, no, it's not going to happen. And of course, that was, there are certain, when you have big major events happening, and you sometimes just want to go and stand in the corner and throw up. And that was one of those moments where okay, I got to go to this corner, I'm going to throw up. But that's how I just, instead of doing that, I said, where's Joe Gatta? I got to find Joe. And I said, Joe, if your lawyer comes out here and my lawyer comes out here and they can close the deal in 48 hours, then we have a deal. And he said, let's do it. And that's how the deal ended up with New Image. And to their credit, they made the movie, and they paid all what they had to pay. But I was concerned, and I let my board know that I think the movie will get made, but I am not sure we're going to get a good movie, because they have never made a good movie.
By the summer of 2007, you then had a film deal with Avi Lerner's New Image, but there was no script and no director. How was the process of locking down those, and what happened with the prospective star Vin Diesel?
So we actually, I think the Vin Diesel may have been a way to get the attention of CAA. He was repped at CAA at the time, and to get them to vouch for, let's do a deal with Millennium. But I think the Avi was very clear, as well, if I don't have a big star, then I have to have a big director. So and all of us, and remember, Millennium it's a very, at the time, ownership have changed a little bit back and forth, but it's really Avi Lerner's. He makes the decisions there, and then he has a cadre of executives who basically know how their business works. It's very close. It's very self-contained. So the first marching order was, of course, let's get a script together so we can attract a really great director. And we we enlisted Donnelly and Oppenheimer, a writing team. They came in with a great pitch. They actually went off and started writing, and it took time. It actually took it, and screenwriting takes time. You can't force the creative process, and it's not like you have a writer's room when you do a feature film script. So they took, I would say, they took almost 8 months to write the script, and it might have been. It probably took us 4 months to sift through and sit with all the writers and select them. So about a year, I would say it was about a year after we signed the deal with Millennium that the screenplay was finished. And I remember we got it on a Friday night. We got the first draft, and we all said, okay, let's read it over the weekend, and then we'll reconnect on Monday. And then I get a call from one of my, from Joe, I think, on Sunday, to me saying, well, we have our director. I said, what? Yeah, we have the director. It's going to be Brett Ratner, because Avi met him at a party yesterday, and he's a huge Conan fan, so he's going to be our director. So we really, that screenplay was never really shown to any directors at that time. It was really a handshake between Avi and Brett that that he would be the director, and that was it. And then then we all go up to Brett's house and we sit with him and we talk about, like, oh, what's his vision? And it was pretty clear to me that I think I don't know, he was dancing around the project. He clearly wanted to do it, but he was unsure that Millennium would give him the budget that he wanted to make the movie. And sometimes I'm thinking back, I wonder how a Brett Ratner movie would have been. But then, of course, I saw Hercules, which came some time after, because he never really committed to Conan. And the reason we heard was that he wasn't getting the financial commitments that he wanted. He was working a little bit on the script back and forth, but not much happened. And then, this is me speculating, but again, I met with Marcus several times, Marcus Nispel, who ultimately was hired to direct the film. And Marcus had done Pathfinder before. And, Marcus was clearly, I think after Pathfinder, he was a little bit in movie jail, you would say, but he also had done some really successful Michael Bay movies. He had directed a couple of movies, but of course,
like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake, he directed that for Platinum Dunes, which was a Michael Bay's production company.
Correct, and there was some really interesting camera work there. There was a really interesting shots, and it was clear that Marcus can shoot the hell out of stuff, and he has a brain which is filled with every scene from every movie and every art ever, that he can pull that out from his brain. And I really love Marcus as a person, but he's an enigma to me as a filmmaker, because his background was also huge with huge commercials, and that doesn't mean that you can pull off a feature film, but clearly a visual aficionado. And my guess is that it was a very painful process when Marcus was directing for Platinum Dunes, because Michael Bay is, he knows exactly how he wants his movies, and he's an amazing editor himself and an amazing, so I think they forced Marcus to basically shoot what was almost totally storyboarded before, and they used him as an amazing shooter, but I think it must have been a very painful process for Marcus. So he wanted to basically be in control of the movie, and he really wanted to do Conan again. I think he was a massive fan of the first movie, and he was a massive fan of the Frank Frazetta images, but Marcus's strength is not the written word. And I think his brain is just working in visual patterns and not so much. So he had a movie in his brain. So the script started changing. I think we had a pretty solid script. And then Marcus was announced by Millennium at Cannes. And I think a lot of the executives and even the distributor at the time was Lionsgate, then for North America. I think nobody had seen that coming. That was just announced. So all of a sudden, we had another a verdict, and that was it's going to be Marcus Spell directing the film. And then, then that's it. If the head of the studio has made a deal and decided, then you have to circle the wagons and do the best you can. I think it was a very challenging production. I was on set, of course, for a lot of the time, and the first act is pretty much the only act which wasn't changed by the director's team on the pages. So and that's because the physical production, we were shooting this in Millennium's Bulgarian studios, and the first act had already been built. The sets had been built. So it was Avi Lerner's brother at the time who was the producer in Bulgaria, and he just said basically, nope, we cannot change anything that's in the first 20 pages. That stays.
It's interesting to hear about the changes. An early script by Donnelly and Oppenheimer was leaked online, and that is quite a bit different from the final movie, where Sean Hood is also credited as writer. Can you elaborate on that?
And I'm not sure the first script that Oppenheimer and Donnelly wrote has been leaked. I'm not sure. But that was different from the shooting script, because what happened was when Marcus... That was the script that was floating around, and we were sort of waiting for the right director, but we were not being able to really ask any directors until Brett Ratner had officially left the project, which nobody really knew. It was all Avi knew, and that was, we never really got that script out to directors. So when Marcus was hired, he started working with Oppenheimer and Donnelly to rewrite the script to his vision. And that may be the script, because eventually, and Oppenheimer and Donnelly became increasingly frustrated with that process. They ultimately left and said, nope, we're not going to finish this. That's when Sean Hood was brought in. And it was an interesting, and then we needed somebody to rewrite. And we talked to some people, but Sean Hood was always the favorite go-to writer for Millennium. They had used him on quite a lot of stuff. And we did meet with some people for rewrite, but this was now fall of 2009. So things were getting a little urgent now to get going, because they had to start shooting in early 2010. So I think that Sean came in because he is a very fast writer, and he was on set writing pages that would be shot in a few days. So that is not a process you want to be in with any feature film. So I think Sean was a trooper, and he was really working day and night. And Sean knows his Howard, and he knows, and he's actually a solid writer, but he was also stuck in that process. How are you going to shoot write stuff that the director is saying, no, I want it this way. And at the end of the day, I think that was part of the problem, is that there was a sense of urgency. So I don't think you can blame Oppenheimer and Donnelly, and I don't think you can blame Sean Hood either. It's a quite common occurrence, because with these big movies, once the train leaves the station, you can't stop that train. It's just going. And then everybody just has to do all they can to hold it together and make it as good as it can. And if you have a little bit of dissonance on set, then it's going to get ripple effects. And that's what happened. Looking back at the whole process, I think that the ambition was higher than the execution actually could. I think they had very, very high ambitions, and I think they set themselves up for disappointment. But there are things with that film which I think stand out and are solid and pretty good. And I think as an adventure movie, it still actually is very Howard-esque, but it's a pastiche. It's not a true Howard story. And but looking back at it, it was a challenging process. It's a challenging process.
Before we get into the box office and subsequent fallout, can you tell us about the casting process?
Yeah, so we had a great casting director, Carrie Barden, out of New York, and we, of course, when you cast, you get these binders of just tons of people, and then of course a lot of people and agents and managers will leak things just to get their. I remember at one point, I think Marcus was flying over to Bulgaria for some prep or from some scouting or something, and he ended up in an airplane with Arnold's body double, Roland Kickinger, and all of a sudden, somehow it's leaked that next day is that Roland Kickinger is in discussions to play Conan the Barbarian, which was of course never the case. But if I was Roland Kickinger's agent or manager and he calls me and says, I just sat on the plane with Conan director, I would make sure that news hit the internet the next day. So we were looking at people, but it was kind of a challenge, and it came down to a couple of different people. And to Marcus' credit, he fought very hard for Jason Momoa, and Carrie Barden had also cast Game of Thrones. So Game of Thrones hadn't come yet, but he said, I got the perfect Conan. And we got to see, of course, first you see the stills of Jason and you read up on him, and I could see that this is his personality seems to be perfect for Conan. And then we met him, and he was a massive, big guy, of course. And then it was down to him and Kellen Lutz. And at the time, I remember some of the investors or some of the Millennium people were really rooting for Kellen Lutz because Kellen had been huge in Twilight. And he really wanted to play Conan too. He wanted to play, go into this genre. And I like him a lot. He's a sweet guy. He's super cool. But of course, to me, when you see Jason Momoa and Marcus Nispel shot a little trial scene with Jason, and then he did the same with Kellen. But it was somewhere that must be available, because it was, when you see that clip, it's like he was born to play Conan. It was like he was It was just he was fantastic.
Yeah, I've seen it. To see him like really going nuts with the sword, chopping against the grass
chopping.
background.
Yeah, he's chopping down. It was shot in the fall up on Sunset or on Mulholland Drive, and he's just chopping down this poor palm tree. And there's this rage, and then of course I think Marcus, he knows how to shoot a commercial, so he scored it with I can't remember, I think it was Led Zeppelin or something, really heavy metal soundtrack, and then this and big fans. So it was just a great scene. So we all saw that, and I remember we all signed off on Jason, and then it was down to. He needed to have an audition or a meeting with Joe Drake, who was the head of Lionsgate. And I still remember, because of course Joe said, "Oh, he's great, but he's got to shave. He's got a beard. I'm not sure about this, because can you trust people who have beards?" and then of course Jason said, "Well, I will shave if I get the role." And it's funny with Jason. He's a big guy. He's 6'4", I think, or maybe 6'5", 6'4", 6'5". But he really has to fight very hard to or work very hard to build muscle, because his body is more the swimmer type. So it's actually, he's very lean, and he's tall, but to build that bulk is not easy for him. You think about it, it's 6 months when you shoot these movies. It takes 6 months or something like that, and all the time, plus of course a couple of months before in training and stuff. And all this time, all he can eat is basically chicken breast and spinach and peanut butter, and he has to spend every day 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon in the gym. So it's hard work, and I thought he looks like a great Conan, actually.
Can I take you back to like when the movie first opened? Like, can you kind of take us real quick through like leading right up to the opening weekend, and then how the numbers started coming in and how you guys were reacting to how, just kind of that moment where you kind of realized, yeah, this isn't going to go the way everybody thought it was?
I think actually it started in the summer where tracking, you have tracking and you do a lot of sort of polling around what people's expectations are. And with films like this, the P&A, the advertising budget doesn't kick in until very, very late in the game, because you don't want to put too much money into TV advertising and big commercials until people can actually see the movie. If they see a trailer, they want to go out, they should be able to see the movie within a week or two, basically. But the movie wasn't tracking very well in the right demographics, and Lionsgate spent a lot of money on P&A, but in hindsight, I think they spent it on the wrong demographic. They tried to capture the younger audience, whereas Conan at the time probably would have had a bigger chance if they had aimed the campaign on the older Conan fans. And so a lot of people didn't even know, of older Conan fans, didn't even know that there was a Conan movie in theaters. And we could see that in different markets it actually performed quite well, but as overall the numbers came in, it was not a great time at all. And I think we were fighting, I think there was a Fright Night movie that weekend, and it was a Fright Night, and it was one other franchise that came, but the big issue was also that there was a strong holdover. There was some movie, I can't remember now, there was a movie that was actually performing very strong that had opened late July and just kept going, and so the box office total that weekend was not great. I think it was total was like 120 million or something like that, and it was just a tough spot. That day you just basically travel around town, you go to movie theaters, and you see, you try to see the audience reaction, and it's kind of, you're on a high when you open up a movie. That's a great time, but it's always over on Monday morning, and it's actually over already on Sunday when you start getting the box office results. So it was clear that, okay, we didn't do well, and I got some very nasty email on Monday morning from Millennium, and but that's how the game is, right? So at the same time, I also got a phone call from the head of Universal, who said, let's have a lunch. I think we can. I think I know what's wrong with this film.
We'll get back to that phone call from Universal before long, but in the meantime, the Millennium Conan movie underperformed in a major way at the box office. Sean Hood's scripted sequel was scrapped, and eventually Millennium handed back the license. How hard did all of that hit Paradox Entertainment?
Well, that's a good question too. I had issued some concerns that we have to have a plan B for this to the board, that we cannot really just bank on a huge success here, and what do we do if it's not? And those calls went unheard, because for various reasons, corporate policies, they didn't want to do it. So we had to quickly realize that, okay, we got to downsize fast here, because the expected uptick in licensing and merchandising activities would not come quickly. So we had to basically, I think I took a pay cut I took a 50% pay cut. We reduced staff by half, just to cut overhead. And still at that time we started seeking, which was a great learning experience for myself. We started to secure and help structure financing for other movies. So we actually, and again, when people say, well, he's produced all these movies, well, that's not true. Sometimes you get a producer credit for arranging financing and structuring and being behind the scenes. And on some movies that I have a producer credit on, there are 27 other producers. So, but I might have come in with securing funding for some of these films, which was a relatively strong indie film sector came back in 2008, 9, 10. And you started seeing what we see in television now, that people could actually pre-sell movies at the film markets. And all they needed were some stars, and but there was a budding film market for indies in the late 2000s there that started to come, and so we tried to secure enough of business through that to winter over until we could have something new coming on one of our IPs, not necessarily Conan. But what the film did, which people forget, is that it actually was a huge signal that Conan is back. And Conan is a strong character and a strong IP. Because what people don't know is that when Conan was in theaters, it was the number one most illegally downloaded film on the internet after Harry Potter. So I think we had like 30 or 60 million downloads, illegal, of course, but it was massive. So I would say that overall, people are so sophisticated now, and we're so used to great genre films, and people know there's sites like yours that explain the mechanisms behind the scenes and so forth. So I think either people take to themselves what's good, and they disregard what's bad. So we all, like, if we're Star Wars fans, I love The Mandalorian. I may not particularly like Rogue One. So it's like, that doesn't mean I hate Star Wars if I don't like Rogue One. I'll just disregard that one. It doesn't count for me. But I like Mandalorian. So I think what it did was it just meant that, we carved out a niche that, the Barbarian is back. Can we perform better? Can we do better? But it's clear that there is something here. So that's the takeaway.
How did it affect you? And not to jump too far ahead, because then we can come back to this, but I just got to ask, since Jason Momoa, of course, was involved with Game of Thrones, did that really kind of affect you guys going down the road? Like, wow, we were ahead of the game just that much? Because Conan in and of itself is it can be seen in a very similar light as Game of Thrones. You have a lot of the same elements. It's a more adult oriented, adventure sci-fi franchise. Did that affect you at all? Did it bother you or get you at any point?
Well, I think it was, there's so many moving elements in filmmaking that of course that part was right. Our casting director found the perfect Conan at that time, right? So you take that away, like, okay, we were ahead of the curve because we hadn't seen Game of Thrones. Nobody had seen Game of Thrones, and then after the fact, then it's like, oh shit, they really did a great job with Game of Thrones. That reinforced my feeling that we should not focus on feature-length film. We should actually focus on, cable or streaming. Streaming wasn't really big then, but we should really look at doing a series as opposed to features.
Absolutely. But before we get into streaming, there was another Conan movie that was in development for a couple of years, namely Legend of Conan by Universal. Tell us a bit about the rise and fall of that.
After the Millennium film, I was thinking, okay, we should probably think about a series here. And because Game of Thrones was up and running, and now we could see that that's probably a better medium. But I had a series of meetings with Jeff Kirschenbaum over at Universal, and he said, here's the thing. People want Conan as a feature film, but they want Arnold to be Conan. And his career was not 100% at the time. And so Jeff, probably rightly so, he said, well, there's still a big contingent of people who want to see Arnold in certain roles. And one of his most iconic performances is Conan. So people will come back to see Arnold in Conan. And I liked that. I was struggling with, but shouldn't we do a series instead? But especially back then, we're in 2012, 2011. Then it was still very much attractive to see a big blockbuster movie first, and then you can follow up with TV. And that's how you used to do it in those days. In the past, that's how it was always. So we met with the team over at Universal and Arnold, and we all kind of shared. It was Chris Morgan, one of the top writers there, who came in, and he basically, at a breakfast meeting with Arnold, he pitched the movie scene by scene. And he's just the greatest pitch maker. It was the greatest story, and the underlying story actually was taking elements from David Gemmel's Legend, which was a fantasy book in the 80s, which was very, very popular back then, which basically was an older Conan, the champion that has gone off to the mountain and basically is drawn back into battle. So great story, but then things are very difficult because you have to get a script together. And just as we got the script, and there were the business affairs among the studios can take months to conclude deals with not just the rights holders, but with writers and actors, and especially writers. And the writers can't wait. So if business affairs takes 3 months to negotiate with one writer, and then he needs work, and then he's off running something else. So we were struggling to find the right concoction there on the script. And the day the first draft of the script, not the first draft, but the day the studio draft, the one that the producers will give to the studio, was finished, that was the same week as Jeff Kirschenbaum announces that he was leaving Universal. And he was the champion behind the project there. And they had one more year left on the option. And at that point, it was sort of, we were left without an executive, without a champion in there. And then it was really up to Chris Morgan, who's a producer, but is also extremely busy writing all their big Fast and Furious movies and overseeing, he was overseeing the whole Dark Universe. It was very difficult for him to focus on. And by the way, after the deal was done, it turned out he didn't write the script. Someone else was going to write the script, and he would oversee it. So we were hampered by classic studio problems. I wouldn't call it development hell, but that last year was development hell, because then we were just waiting out for the option to expire. And we brought in a couple of directors, and I'm very happy to say that we actually brought in some really great guys before they really scored high. But the movie didn't happen there. And then we got.
Can you tell us who? Can you say who some of those directors who were in contention were?
Well, I mean, we had of course the issue. You have agents for people, and then you have agents even for. In this case, it was going to be Arnold, and before people are really famous, then the town will be a little bit, how do you say it? They'll be hesitant, because nobody really wants to make a judgment based on what they see themselves. They like to sort of see, well, this guy is hot right now. Let's go to that guy or that guy. But I think for me, the one name or the one person that I thought was the most interesting was Miguel Sapochnik, because he had done, we could see, I met him and he was on Game of Thrones, right? And he directed the Battle of the Bastards episode, which subsequently won an Emmy, but he had not won the Emmy then. So they thought of him, and he had been, people thought of him as a TV director. But if you watch the Battle of the Bastards episode from Game of Thrones, and you just basically say, well, that is Conan. He's basically fighting himself up a pile of corpses here. So that was, I was very excited about Miguel, but that was late in the option, and it was too late. And also, of course, we haven't even touched the subject of, well, what about the rating? Without a executive defending the whole project, would a studio like Universal be able to do an R-rated movie, and who would do this? So I think it was, the whole town was kind of thinking that if the executive has left, this is going to be a dead project, a lame duck kind of. But I do think that Miguel could have been an amazing director for Conan there.
Yeah, and on top of that, Terminator Sega Genesis, as I like to call it, also flopped right around that time, and that probably didn't do any wonders either.
I mean, here's the thing: I think Jeff was right when he said, "Well, Arnold may not be successful in all these other movie projects, but people want to see him in Conan." I think he's right there, and I think there is something with the Conan role, which is, or the Conan character, which actually is very appealing to Arnold. I think with Conan, he's playing himself. I really, really have this, feeling that, he's coming from that background in the Alps, and he's bullied as a kid, and he builds himself up, and he becomes Mr. Universe, and then he becomes the biggest action star. Then he becomes the governor. To me, there is a very big component of Conan in Arnold's own personal life, and I think as an actor, when you're in a later stage of your career, you're tapping more into you're not playing so much a role as you're playing yourself. And I think Jeff was right in that analysis, and I would love to find a way where we collaborate with Arnold again, because it's just painful when you're sitting there from between 2012 up until, I don't know, 2016 or 2017, and the years go by, and you're just sitting and it just. That's the frustration of movie making, that these projects take so long to come to fruition.
As you say, it's a long and time-consuming process indeed. And we have the Amazon and the Netflix project. But before we get into those, let us briefly take a side trip into, or side quest, if you will, into some of the other properties that you actually did get off the ground, such as Mutant Chronicles and Solomon Kane. What can you tell us about those before we get back to Conan?
So Mutant Chronicles was a long journey for Ed Pressman Film Corporation, where they took out the license in '95, and they worked on various scripts. At some point, they actually did entertain an Arnold starring in the role. There were a number of scripts written, a number of directors came and went, and in the late '90s, we came very close. Or if it was even back in 2000, very close to getting it made at Pinewood. Fox was financing and distributing, and the director was Stephen Norrington. And Stephen was in prep. We were literally 6 weeks from shooting. Must have been in the late 90s, because Fox pulled the plug when they signed Sigourney Weaver to do another Aliens sequel. And then they felt that Mutant Chronicles would be in competitive turf, so they pulled the plug, and that was, of course, extremely frustrating for everybody who had been involved, not the least Stephen Norrington, who had he then went off and made Blade. So that was a time of options expiring and renewals, and I started getting a reputation of being this obnoxious Swedish person, because of course I would say what like we do in the Nordics, we say what we think pretty much. We're kind of like woodcutters in that sense. And it's hard to be a woodcutter in Hollywood, because you have to, it's all about gearing up optimism and things about projects, because it takes basically a village to make these projects. It's so much work. So after some time, there was this young filmmaker, Simon Hunter, who had approached Ed at the time, probably early 2000s. And this was when the blue screen tech was coming up, which is now green screen. And if you remember, what was it? The Sky of Tomorrow. What was it? Captain?
Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow.
That's right. Sky Captain had come, and everybody was blown away, like, oh, you can do this. So a young filmmaker from London approached Ed Pressman and says, I know how we can make this Mutant Chronicles film, and it doesn't have to cost $75 million. And then he got the job. We re-upped the license with Ed, and they made the movie, and it premiered, I think, in 2006, 2007. And it didn't really, that was at the end of it was an indie film. It was very low budget, and it doesn't really call Mutant Chronicles to me. There's some great scenes in it, by the way, and that's how Simon got the job, because he got a little sum of money, and for a summer, and to shoot a sequence of how he would see the film. And he did this great little 4-minute teaser, which filled its purpose because it attracted Thomas Jane. So Thomas Jane signed on after he saw that, and when Thomas signed on, and then Ron Perlman, and you know. But the movie the production was marred by physical challenges. I think there were 4 or 5 people on set actually that worked so hard they had to go to hospital. They had breakdowns. So it was just another example of, I think, ambition and execution. The ambition was set so high for that film that there's no way they could execute that well with the money that was in the budget. But it happened. And then with Solomon Kane, which was a different producer, that was Sami Hadida, who's a French a great producer. He's sadly passed now. But he was always a big genre fan. He was one of the early Tarantino backers, and he had a big distribution company in France, and among other films, he distributed New Line in France, and of course had probably made a lot of money on Lord of the Rings, and wanted to do more movies like this himself. And Solomon Kane came in, and Michael Bassett directed his own script, and I think the challenge for Metropolitan was, and that's Sami Hadida's company, was that it was a foreign film without the US distribution laid out before. And when you have that, it's kind of fighting, this is what's so difficult with the market, because you can make a great film in Germany and France and Italy, wherever, but it doesn't really exist unless it's in the US. And if you don't have US distribution, all the other buyers around the world are looking, what's wrong? Why doesn't this movie have a US distribution? And then it gets classified on a lower level. So of course, Solomon Kane, when it came out, it premiered it was the #1 movie in France and Spain and those markets where, they knew what they were marketing, but it didn't get distribution for the US for, I think, a year or 2, and eventually I think it was picked up for basically a limited release, but direct to video release. But it's a great film. I like the film. I think it's a little bloated, it's a little long, and it has it loses itself a little bit in the end. But I think it's well directed, and I like it. I like it. Although my concern with the film is, of course, it's all about Solomon Kane's backstory. Whereas what I like about Solomon Kane and many of Howard's characters is that they don't really have a backstory, and they don't need it, because they're just, they're like the Mandalorian. They come out and they just, they exist. So I think that was perhaps, but that was what the movie was about, to explain, of course, to the modern audience, what is a Puritan, and why is he a Puritan, and why is he so crazy?
Yeah, I happen to know that the reason it was that, because that was a requirement to get the funding to make that movie. Because at the time, and you also see the Millennium Conan movie suffered from this. They had like this need to give an origin story, a relic from Batman Begins. But I agree, it was such a shame that the trilogy never happened because of the distribution situation, because Solomon Kane is a fantastic movie. And for anyone out there that haven't seen it, absolutely go check it out. You'll be glad you did. And with that, let us move on now to the streaming services with an Amazon Conan and later the Netflix Conan. But before that, there was another corporate event happening, the transitioning from Paradox to Cabinet Entertainment, where the Conan and Robert E. Howard library sits right now. Can you take us briefly through that story?
It was clear after the Millennium Conan, it was clear that we were on clashing pathways, myself and my board of directors, and where to take the company and how to do it. And a lot of that had to do with the inherited situation of having a public company with really a very small business center here in Los Angeles, when the owners and the board are sitting over in Sweden. And it's difficult. It's 9 hours time difference, and it's extremely difficult to really understand how Hollywood works if you're not in Hollywood, right? So there had been some tension growing between me and some of the board members, and then finally I just basically said, and there was also one moment when I guess I had become too American, in the sense that, if there's something about Swedes, it's that they're like they're like ants, they talk and talk and talk, and meetings and meetings and meetings and meetings and meetings and meetings, and nothing really is decided. But once it's decided, then everybody will do that. It has to be so you're really, like in the US, you just talk to the head of the company and you make a deal and then it happens. But in Sweden, you have to really talk to all the individual people of the team, and not until everybody agrees, then the boss of that company will say, oh, okay, okay, then we'll do this. So it's just but here, of course, in the US, it's the opposite. It's really still very driven from people who will be replaced if they make the wrong decisions, because the organizations here are quite small for, it's very scalable, but the decision-making process is very different here. So I guess I had been, changing my way, and I was just a little fed up with this, we all have to be in agreement of everything we do. And I felt that, my time is probably up here. So I resigned, and I was going to make everything myself and on my own, and I set up my own company, and that was Cabinet. And it was clear to me that something would happen, and I kept in contact with the majority owner, because they didn't really have nothing happened, and they kept bleeding. They lost money, and then an idea started formulating in my mind that maybe I could actually raise my own financing and just buy the IP, and not necessarily and let them have the stock listing, and they could change, because they were clearly not really having a vision of what they wanted to do. And that was concluded about a year after I left the company. I reached out around Christmas time to the majority owner and said, would you be interested in this? And he said, yes, I would be. And then I started negotiating with them, and that deal concluded. And it was actually it was a public company, so everything had to be really, which isn't the best for when you're doing a deal. Of course, that means whatever you do will be transparent. They have to tell everybody in the world what's going on here. So it's fairly clear what happened, and they had been trying to sell the company, and they had employed a financial advisor in Stockholm, and they had done a little prospectus the year before, after I had left, and they hadn't managed to sell the company. So I just basically went in and took the last offer they received, which had been a stock offer, and I said, listen, I'll match that, raise it by 40%, and it'll be a cash offer. And then they accepted that. So it was fairly clean.
And after that, you were the owner of Conan, the king
Correct.
of Conan.
Well, not the king of Conan, but he's a great warrior. He's hard to control. He has a mind of his own. But yes, then I could basically just follow my own vision.
Exactly. And
the keeper of the legend, then how's that? The keeper of the legend.
That's good. I like the keeper of the legend.
Yeah, the Keeper of the Legend. That's a great one. And you mentioned that your vision was a Game of Thrones style series. And this brings us to Amazon and Ryan Condal, who was the showrunner for the Amazon series, which was set up for a time. What can you tell us about that?
Before we did the Universal deal, I had actually started thinking that we should go for a cable show like Game of Thrones. We should go that way. But I was convinced that let's do one last hurrah and try for a blockbuster film, which means you're losing the 4 or 5 years. And then then after 4 or 5 years is gone, it's like, okay, well, here we are again. And this time nope, we are going to do it as a series. And there was, again, I think people in Hollywood, there is a generational shift, and Ryan is of this generation, and so was Miguel, and both directors and showrunners. There's a rising tide of Conan fans who are now showrunners and big directors. And that wasn't the case maybe 10, 15 years ago to the same extent. And they know the source material very well, right? So Ryan had Ryan Condal, who was showrunner at the time of Colony, And I knew of his writing. He had written some phenomenal scripts that I had read. For instance, when Sean Hood was hired to do the rewrite for Conan, I was advocating for Ryan Condal to do the rewrite, because Ryan Condal had a writing sample called Hercules, and Sean Hood had a Hercules too. And of the two scripts, I said, look at this script. This is a very, very good script, that Ryan Condal's Hercules. Unfortunately, the film strays away from this. But if you read his Hercules script, you'll really enjoy it, I think. And he had several strong feature scripts, but then he had started working on Colony as a movie. So he knew, I think, that the option was coming up, and took a meeting with me, and he had made a little pamphlet, a book of how he saw Conan as a series. And it was very revenant. It was very much about man and nature. And, it was very true to what we had done with Dark Horse Comics and all of the work we had done with Funcom. And he clearly knew his Howard, and he wanted to make it, he had a great vision. And so we said, let's keep in touch, and we'll see when the rights come back from Universal. And when they did, we took a meeting with him, and in the interim, I had mentioned to him, I think, that Miguel Sapochnik is a really great director, and the two of them had gotten together and cooked up some little concoction, and so they came in, and we already knew both. So it was a very, very interesting phase, because then we decided, let's not option this to someone else. Let us instead partner up, and we partnered up with what is now Endeavor Content, but at that time it was pre-Endeavor Content, so that we could actually control the creative phase. So we together with Endeavor Content as our co-studio, we wrote a pilot, and Miguel did a fantastic lookbook, which was then taken out to town. We added Warren Littlefield came on board as an EP, and of course he's a legendary character here, massive experience from the studio side, and also producing shows like Fargo, Handmaid's Tale, fantastic. And then we took it out, and Amazon was really interested very, very early on. They said, we really like this, we like the pilot, and we did the deal with them. And then, of course, Amazon was very aggressive, and also followed up with, they acquired all the Lord of the Rings rights, and we were off to town and wrote 3 episodes for this series, which I think are just amazing, fantastic screenplays. And then ultimately what happened, only as we were turning these scripts in for them, and that would be the green light material, is they had a leadership change at Amazon. And the new leaders just said, why are we doing this? We want to focus on, family-friendly other material. So the good thing was that since we had done this ourselves, we didn't lose so much time. We didn't have to sit out. We weren't lame ducks. We could basically just turn around and just, okay. But that material, of course, we can't use, because unfortunately that's how it works. It's, someone else commissions it, someone else works on it. And Ryan and Miguel, of course, went on. It was sad parting, but they went on and are now in the Game of Thrones. They worked on, they're working on the spin-off Game of Thrones material right now.
Yeah, that's dragon fire Targaryen something thing.
Yeah.
So we wish them luck with that. It's a shame that those scripts belong with Amazon, because from what I've heard, I haven't read them myself yet, but I've heard that they were incredible. But that, of course, wasn't the end. It was for a while, but you were, of course, free to approach someone else. And not too long ago, it was announced that Conan is now at Netflix. Now, this is still in development, so I guess there's not so much that you can say about it. But what can you share about this project? Like, how did it happen?
Well,
and, what's the current status?
I'm excited because we have, how should I explain it? It's So, Netflix is actually an interesting beast here because they're growing leaps and bounds. And it's not like, the expression of drinking from a fire hydrant. That's the growth they have, right? But it's not just drinking from a fire hydrant. It's like you're drinking from 4 fire hydrants because they have this massive need for content. And they have really revolutionized the whole market. But there are very few people. So again, if you get picked up by somebody who has a passion for the project inside of Netflix, you know that the chance is very high that it will get made because they don't have time to waste on stuff that's just being in development. So that's number one why it's really great to be doing a deal with Netflix. Another one is, of course, that in this instance, when we did the Ryan Condal, Miguel Sapochnik package and we take it out, then people buy into a package. They buy into, okay, here's the filmmaker, here's it. But when you have executives who are involved in the creative process, they're actually investing their own time and passion and taste. So in this instance, we are very fortunate that we started, my production partner, Mark Wheeler, and we started with, let's go in and just explain to the executives, 2 top guys, what is Conan? And we did it, it's almost 2 years ago. It's actually, it's a long time ago. But we went in and we just showed them, here are the board games, here are the video games, here are the comic books, here's the history, here's Arnold, here's this. And it was an eye-opener for them because many people don't know how huge the legacy of Conan is. They just know of the Arnold movie, or if that actually, and then they don't know that, well, maybe that's not the Howard Conan, but it is a Conan, and people love that movie. And then you have to overcome the challenges. Oh, okay, so there are so many stories. So he's like a James Bond of fantasy. So you can span from young Conan to old Conan. And once you've explained that, and basically shown them the world of Conan, then most executives would understand that, wow, this is a massive franchise if we do it right. And I think that we got that feeling after 2 or 3 meetings there that they got it. And then they basically said, we want to do this. So that's exciting. And then what we're doing now, I can't tell you much, except, of course, we had a massive response from everybody in town, from filmmakers and showrunners who want to be involved, which we really didn't have with the Amazon project, because remember, that was us just basically going with Ryan and Miguel and not really opening up for anybody else to come in and join the party until, of course, the show would be up and running, and then you'd need more directors and more writers, of course. But this is a little different, so it's very exciting. We're right now still in the selection of who is going to write and what is the first entry point in for this, because as we have said, and as is in Netflix's business model too, is, of course, we want to this shouldn't be just one series. It should be feature films. It should be anime. They're very successful and very aggressive in anime, and very, very successful actually worldwide. And what I like about the streaming business is that you can tell episodes that are actually perfect for that particular episode. We mentioned Mandalorian before, and you can see there too. It doesn't have to be the standard 1 hour format. It can be, well, if this episode's 34 minutes, it's 34 minutes. So I love that about the direct-to-consumer approach, because you can actually deliver something which doesn't even have to follow the 8 episode or 10 episode or 13 episode. No, whatever is good for this character in this moment, and whatever is good for Conan in this age. So all I can say is we're excited and we're in development, and I think so far so good.
Is that kind of what you guys are shooting for, at least? Is kind of like a more of an anthology kind of Conan, not like a set season by season thing, but like you just said, a movie for one story, perhaps an anime for another, or
definitely
a short film for another.
Yes.
Is that kind of what you're going after?
That's kind of what we're going. However, you need to start somewhere, and I think the series is where you want to, you want to put the flagpole down somewhere, and that's the ongoing series. But it doesn't mean that it has to be, 4 seasons of 13 episodes each. It's just that, you got to start somewhere, and that's the trick That's the magic sauce that you want from your writers to come up with, like, here's how we do it. And that's the exciting part of any, it's not so much making the business deal or, but this is when things are formed. And the team that we're working with over at Netflix have massive experience. I mean, Witcher, here's the thing. It's like, it's hard to make something, and it's even harder to make something good. And I think at Netflix, what they really are doing is these big spectacles, and they actually know what they're doing. And of course, there's a hit and miss with anything that's growing with the speed that Netflix is. But Witcher is amazing. They've been fantastic on Umbrella Academy, different thing, but great, fantastic, success there. Even Warrior Nun. I mean, and then you have all the originals from overseas too. They're tapping into a massive creative talent pool. So that's where we are now, and I am excited because, of course, it's a big deal, and we are directly involved, and with people who actually they get this character and they get the material, and we've had time to educate the people and send them reference stuff, and including, of course, the new Marvel stuff, which is also exciting.
Before we get into the Marvel stuff, I have another question that everyone has in conjunction with the Netflix series. If you look at the comments on our videos about the Netflix series, and indeed anywhere else where it's being discussed, the recurring concern is that Conan will be altered or otherwise toned down so as to better align with, let's call it, modern day sensibilities. Star Wars, Star Trek and Doctor Who are franchises that have been remolded to this end, and much to their detriment according to large swaths of their fans. Will Conan 2 be watered down, or will he be allowed to be the badass from the original stories he always was?
I think you have to give the audience what they're expecting, and Conan, I mean, he's a politically incorrect badass, as you say, and I think that's not to say that he's misogynist or that he's I personally think that Conan is actually not that complex. He's apolitical. He's just, as you said, he's living in prehistoric times, and I don't think anybody really wants to do a family-friendly Conan. I think there is a debate right now about masculinity and what's toxic masculinity and all of these things. And it's funny because when I read Howard's Conan stories, I never see him as again, of course, these stories were written in the 30s, but they still hold up as really fresh, really, vibrant and very valid today. So I don't think anybody would like to. And I think actually that's probably why Universal eventually didn't make Conan, because it's like, why are we making this? Unless there's a champion inside that company, who fights for it and explains to everybody else, why are we making this? And I think also there is a valid point of maybe, Hollywood's always following the pendulum, and maybe there's been so much a social justice warrior or whatever movement towards only female heroes that people are actually saying, like, can we at least have one male, leading badass? And I think that, obviously, I don't know what Netflix people think behind their locked doors, but you can see from The Witcher and from other, Game of Thrones is a good example. These are shows that are made and loved by millions and millions of viewers. I think Witcher has nobody knows exactly how many viewers they have, but I think it's surpassed Game of Thrones. And I think we can do even better with Conan. I think we can do a better show than Witcher. And I love all genre shows, but I think, and people say, oh, but isn't there, The Witcher is also a badass and brutal. It's like, he's not Conan. There's a difference here.
There absolutely is, so I'm very relieved to hear that. Fingers crossed that behind closed doors, the powers that be at Netflix also see the need for counter-programming. But you have conquered one more arena, or shall we say reconquered, because that too is in comics. Marvel's initial comic book run from 1970 was vital to Conan's mainstream success, And in 2019, the Conan comic book license went from Dark Horse back to Marvel. How did that come about?
So I didn't know that Marvel was actually entertaining any licenses, but we had felt for the last that first run from Dark Horse was amazing. Kurt Busiek was just he just did a fantastic run, and then we felt for the last, I would actually say, almost 10 years now, but since 2010 it started to go astray a little bit creatively, and we saw a decline in the creative quality, what was coming out of Dark Horse, and that happens, and it's always again, is there a passion at the helm of that particular line? Who's the editor? And also how long does that passion hold out for? And we had a couple of editor changes, and we started thinking, we have to let the rest of the industry know that the Dark Horse license is coming to an end. And we did talk to everybody at a Comic-Con a couple of years back and said, listen, we want to have everybody's creative take and offers coming in before Christmas. And everybody wanted to do Conan, and everybody came in with fantastic plans. But then there was this colorist who mentioned to me, Jose Villarrubia is a good friend and very, very good colorist for comics. And he said, that they are huge Conan fans inside of Marvel. I said, really? So he told me a name, and I reached out to that person and said, we are actually looking for a new creative package. Would Marvel be interested? And then they were. And then we started talking to them on a monthly basis. We had, exchanged like, well, how would that look and what would this look? And so we did with everybody, including Dark Horse. And then at the end of that year, we made the decision to move over to Marvel. And I think they really treat Conan there as it's a very big trophy for them, because it is a Marvel character to the Marvel people, and it has a 50th anniversary now, and I think it was a very sad moment when they lost Conan back in the Chapter 11 back in 99. And then I think the timing was right, because they probably couldn't have licensed a character that wasn't created and owned by Marvel. But now they opened up for that, and we discussed it, and I'm very happy with what they've done so far. The Conan Exodus, which is about it's a fantastic Esad Ribic story with basically about a young Conan, very Revenant style, coming out of Cimmeria. The interesting thing with Marvel is, of course, that we can now let Conan play with the other Marvel characters, like in Savage Avengers, which is, to some purists, of course, that's not for them. But we've taken the approach like, listen, Conan is so much more than just what you want Conan to be. If you don't like this particular take, don't read that. But some people love to see Wolverine fight Conan. And it's kind of, we have to have a little bit of fun. If anywhere you can have fun with characters, it should be comics.
Yeah, I have to agree. I think that the Savage Avengers with Conan in the modern day is actually really a fun title. And at the same time, you have Jim Sub, who is doing an amazing job on the regular Conan the Barbarian title set in the Hyborian Age. We also had a great interview with Jim Sub here a few months back, so everyone be sure to check that out.
Jim is amazing, and it's interesting also how, again, he's of that age where we're all coming up now and have a joint background with role-playing games and world building.
Indeed. Speaking of world building, what do you think of the future for not just Conan, but the other Howard properties like Solomon Kane, King Kull? Is there any chance that these could end up on Netflix as well down the line if everything works out, or somewhere else?
I think yes to both, but I think the focus is, and I think the lesson learned is, it kind of starts with the in the crown, and that is Conan. So I think, you know, it's probably, like, I myself found that it's better to have all the rights at one point, because then you can actually start seeing Howard's threads between the characters, and that there is a creative link between Bran McMorn and Cull and Conan, and it is a Howard verse, if you want. And I think if the task at hand is to make Conan really good, and if Conan's really good, then all the other characters can follow. It's not only about optioning out characters left and right, it's also to get it right? So yes, so obviously, for sure, we would love to see this and then see where it goes, but at this point, we're pretty much focused on Conan right now.
That's very exciting to hear. With that, on behalf of ourselves and our audience, I would like to say thank you for taking the time to tell us about your journey and the journey of Conan and Robert E. Howard over the course of the past 20 years, and for giving us a glimpse into what may still lie ahead.
Thanks, Andre. Thanks, Tom. It was a pleasure, and I hope to come back when we have a great show on the air.
Hopefully we'll talk to you much more between now and then, and much more then as well.
Great. Well, thank you, guys, and enjoy the rest of your day.
You too, and thank you so much for your time, sir.